morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be. I will say up top, I apologize for how I might sound. I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, but we're gonna make it through this. So thanks for joining us today as we head back to the basics. This is part 3 of our webcast series where we take a look at some of the fundamentals and some best practices of using iLogic when we're automating our processes. So in parts 1 and 2, we covered some common workflows like checking and controlling iProperties, passing parameters, suppressing components. We took a look at also at doing some formatting of our code, making our code a little bit easier to read for ourselves and for others. We looked at internal rules, external rules, and the logger, both through the new logger as part of Inventor, as well as some an external app that would do the same thing. You'll be able to find links to both of those videos as well as the recording of this webcast in a follow-up email that Cassie will be sending out next week. So in today's webcast, we're going to talk a little bit about feature controls, material controls, our custom snippets versus our system snippets, and we'll take a look at the iLogic forms or the UIs that we can build. So the first thing I'm going to do here is open up a part called feature controls. The first thing I want to point out is take a look at my model browser, and we'll see that I have named my features a sensible name. Okay, it makes it much easier for me to code and understand what's happening if I've renamed my features. I can control, say, O-ring groove, and I understand what's happening much easier than trying to control revolution 3. Okay? For those who don't know, you can easily rename features by doing the slow double click right there on the model browser. Or in the later releases, they finally gave us the Windows F2 key. If I select my feature, the F2 key there and rename it. Not a whole lot of limits on those. You can put spaces inside of your names for your features. You'll notice none of mine have spaces. I always use an underbar in the place of a space. And that's due to efficiency when I'm selecting that text out in the rules editor or some other text editor. And once we get to that point, I'll talk about that a little bit more. So let's talk about feature suppression. Based upon the current configuration requirements of what's happening, in this case, this pin that we see, I may or may not need a specific feature. Take, for example, this O-ring groove. We don't necessarily want to delete that feature because my next configuration might require it, right? So I might have to unsuppress it. And what we're going to do with code with the iLogic snippet is very similar to simply right-clicking on that feature in my model browser and choosing suppress features. Okay? It's going to do the same thing. I'm just going to do it with automation. Let's right-click on that guy again and choose unsuppress. I'm going to go to my rules tab, and I've already got a rule in here called feature controls. So I'm going to edit this rule. And over in my snippets area, I'm going to take a look at my features category. And when we're talking about controlling suppression states of features, I want to use the isActive snippet, the feature.isActive. As I hover over that, I'll see a tooltip. It's telling me that I can get or set the activity of a feature. It also gives me a little tooltip down there at the bottom. If I set my cursor where I want to enter that text, in order for me to use that snippet, I simply double-click on it, right? And it builds that iLogic snippet, the feature.isActive, right where my cursor was, and then gives me a generic argument of feature name. Okay, that feature name is what feature I need to control. We also notice here in the later versions that I do get some color coding now in the iLogic IDE of what's happening. I see a yellow box on this line telling me that that line has been modified since the last time I've saved it. Okay. If I go ahead and hit save now, it's going to yell at me because I don't have my rule completed there, but now my box is green telling me that that line has been saved. Okay. So again, the basic there is that snippet of feature.isActive, and again with that generic feature name. So remember what our tooltip said. It told me I can get or set the activity or the suppression state of that feature. And that all depends on where I set my equal sign in this case. I do want to control the O-ring groove. So I am going to type in O-ring groove over the feature name. I do need to keep the quotation marks there. It is a string. So if I set this equal to something, and in this case it's going to be true or false, right? If I tell it that feature.isActive O-ring groove is true, it's going to unsuppress the O-ring groove. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and hit save and run. My O-ring groove is on. I can see it in my model browser. I can see it out in my tree. Okay. Let's open that guy back up again. And I'm going to modify this to say equals false. So this is simply suppressing that O-ring groove. Okay, save and run. In my graphics window, it's gone. And again, the same as right-clicking on it and choosing suppress from my model browser. Okay. I talked about getting or setting there. So it all depends on what I'm trying to do. In the case that I have here, I'm setting that feature state. Right? I'm setting it equal to true or false. I can also read that value out. Okay. I'm going to copy and paste here. So I'm setting var, just some variable there, equal to feature.isActive, the O-ring groove. That's going to get the state that the O-ring groove is currently stored in the variable called var. Okay. If I want to throw that out to a very simple message box, I can then say message box var. Right. So I'm going to suppress it and then read the state of it and throw that value out into a message box. Okay. Maybe I need to react upon that. I can build some kind of conditional statement that says, you know, if var equals true or if var equals false. Right? So depending on where that equal sign is on these snippets is whether I'm reading that property or I'm setting that property. Okay? The majority of them allow me to get or set. As I hover over a couple of these others, there are some that are only get. Those are read-only properties. I can get that data out, but I can't set it through code. So I'm going to temporarily suppress those few lines because I don't want that dialog box to pop up. So let's talk a little bit more about feature suppression. We'll take a look at our whole through feature. I copy and paste I don't know how many times a day, so I'm going to copy that line. Okay. And again, here's why I don't put spaces inside of my feature names. If I had spaces where these underbars are, I would have to manually come in and make sure I'm selecting that entire text in order for me to grab entire text. The fact that I have the underbars, I can simply double click and it grabs that entire text string for me. That might sound like a very simple and a very small thing, but if you're doing that over a 10-hour period of a day, that makes a huge difference when I don't have to worry about, am I grabbing the right data? Okay. It's the same thing as if I didn't have spaces and I didn't have underbars, you know, if you wanted to run them all together, that's fine. Just come up with some kind of a standard there where you don't have that space, and it makes it a little bit easier in order to do that. Okay. So if I don't want it that feature name, I can also use my model browser up here at the top. Okay, I want to control my whole through feature. So when I select on the whole through in my model tab, I've got parameters and I've also got a names tab across the top. Okay. If I flip over to my names and then double click the name that I see listed there, it populates that down to where my cursor was. And in this case, I had the O-ring groove highlighted. Right, so it just simply replaced that text with the new text. Okay. It's a much easier way of getting that data out. Again, especially if you have complex names or something like that. So if I save and run this guy now, it's going to suppress not only my O-ring groove, but I've also suppressed that hole that was running through here. Okay. You can also use ones and zeros here, one meaning true or on, zero meaning false, if you'd like to do that instead. So I change those to one and it brings both of those guys back on. Okay. One other way of getting out that data of a feature is using the capture current state. Again, up in my model browser, I can right-click on a feature and choose Capture Current State. Now it populates some data down here inside of my rules editor where my cursor was. It gives me the name of that feature. It gives me the dot active, right? It's telling me that it's currently true. And then it's also going to give me any parameters that have to be involved with that feature. In this case, we were looking at that fillet. So it's giving me the radius that was involved in that. I don't necessarily need this. I might not need that as well. I should be commenting this out, but I'm currently not doing it. And I simply then have my state of how I want that fillet to be. If you don't want to end up copying and pasting and modifying it, you still have a little bit of cleanup work there to do. Okay. And then my fillet right here is turned on. Okay. So let's take a look at controlling features. In previous webcasts, we've looked at using the parameters. We talked about the parameters category. Not all of these, but the common ones for driving those parameters. So if I wanted to modify, say, the O-ring groove, let's go ahead and delete some of these guys. I'm not a big fan of ones and zeros. I like to see the trues and false. So if I want to set my O-ring groove diameter, we'll set that guy to 0.09, and then I'll also set my location to 0.5. Okay, so that's a simple way of controlling that parameter, just modifying the parameter, or I'm sorry, controlling that feature. I'm modifying the parameters that are involved. Right? I moved it down. I might have modified the diameter ever so slightly. If we want to talk about controlling things like the tapped hole diameter, okay, if we look at this through hole down here, he is a tapped hole. If I hover over my model browser here, we see that it's currently at 1024 UNC full depth all the way through. Okay. I can't control that with just my parameters. That is a snippet that's inside of my features category. I can set the thread designation. I can set the thread type, or I can set the thread class individually. There's also one that allows me to set the thread for all. That includes all of those options. The major pain here is I have to type that text exactly like it's listed out in the whole spreadsheet or the thread spreadsheet, or what you see inside of that whole dialog box. Okay. So in this case, if I want to set my whole through, again, I'm going to use my names up here, change my first argument there. What's the feature that you're controlling? Okay. What's the thread type? And again, pulling out of what you see in the whole note. ANSI unified screw threads. And then my thread designation in this case, we'll change it to 1/420. UNC, and then my thread class is going to be 2B. Okay. So we're currently on a 1024. After I run this guy, you notice my hole got larger. I take a look over here now, and in my tooltip that's the extended browser node names, it's telling me it's a 1/420. Again, that text that I'm calling out inside of that type and that size and that designation have to be spelled out just as we see listed out here. That's why I wrote out the full word of ANSI's unified screw threads and the designation. Okay. If you spell that wrong, it's going to balk at you. That guy did not balk at me. Interesting. I'm not sure why it's not yelling at me there. There we go. Right, so quarter 28, I should have had UNF there, not UNC. So that tap designation, it can't find that size inside of that thread spreadsheet in order to modify the feature. Okay. Again, the easy way is looking at that whole dialog to understand how that stuff's being called out. Or you can also use the capture current state of something. If I capture the current state on that whole through node, now I at least get that designation for the tap size. Okay. Again, I keep talking about that thread spreadsheet. That's what the whole dialog box is pulling up. That is located in your design data folder if you want to go dig out and see how all of those things are listed out inside of there. Okay. That's a little bit more about feature controls. We'll cancel that guy out and run that guy. So let's talk about some material controls. Quite often we need to control the material of our Inventor designs. Sometimes we're talking about controlling the material down at the part level, and sometimes we need to go from a top level, say a configurator, pushing that data down. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about at a part level. And I'm going to open up this pencil clip here. If I take a look at my quick access toolbar, we'll see that we're using the silver material now, and the appearance is silver. If I go take a look at my physical iProperty tab, again there the material is telling me that that is silver. So let's start a new rule here. I call this guy material. Very handy, or a very good thing is to always name your rule something that makes sense. Right? Don't leave it as rule 0, rule 1, rule 2, etc. So my materials are in the iProperties. I'm going to open up my iProperties category here. That's the reason I showed you the iProperties tab. So right down here is material. Get or set the current material. Okay. Again, I can either read or write depending on where I end up putting that equal sign. Okay. In order to use that, I'm going to simply double click on it. It doesn't put a whole lot in there for me. It's iProperties.material. Right? And again, if I want to set it to something, I would put equal at the back end of that and then modify what argument I want to end up giving that. So we're currently at silver. I'm going to change that to steel. It does have to be a string argument. And again, it has to be typed exactly like the name of the material that's either in your document or in the active material library. So if I save and run this, if you can see there, it looks a little bit different. If I look up at my quick access toolbar, it's telling me that my material is now steel. Same thing if I switch over to my physical tab there. Okay. If I take a look at the materials that are listed in this, there's not a whole lot of document materials. And we'll notice that we're on the Inventor material library. So if you want to use something out of the Autodesk material library, we would have to be using that as my active, right? So there is a steel paint finish blue that's in the Autodesk library. Okay. If I save and run this, this is what happens when you are not using the proper naming. It tells you that that property that you're trying to set there is probably a bad material name. Okay. In this case, I'm trying to use something out of a different library. So if I simply change my material library to use the Autodesk material library, and then I run my material rule, we'll see that it's switched now, okay, with no issues. So getting that pane or getting that material name is sometimes a little bit of a pain. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and close my clip, close this guy too, and we'll look at pushing that down from the assembly level. We were currently driving that down at the part level, and let's see what it looks like to drive that up from the assembly. So again, I'm going to create a new rule here in my mechanical pencil assembly called material. If I move down a little bit further in my iProperties category, resize this thing a tad bit, we'll see things that say assembly use, right? There's iProperties value, assembly use, assembly use. If I go back to my features, we'll see assembly at the back end of those. Those are snippets that are meant to drive components, right? I'm at the assembly level, so I want to drive the feature of a component that's in my assembly. Or in this case, I want to drive the material of a component that's in my assembly. It's not 100% always named the same. As you can tell there, some of these are called assembly, some of these are called assembly use. If I'm trying to drive the material of a component, it doesn't say either of them, it's called the material of a component. So if I double click this guy, I've got the iProperties.material of component, and then my only argument in this case is the part or the component that I'm trying to drive. Okay. Just like we saw before with the single material, let me go ahead and put him in too. The only difference there is the back half of that function. Okay. So in this case, I'm going to try to drive the clip. Again, I'm going to highlight that. That colon for the occurrence name doesn't allow me to do my little double click. So I have to select that guy. I'm going to grab the clip off my model browser, go to names, double click, so it enters that down and replaces that text. Okay. So in this case, I can say I now want that guy to be copper. Okay. So I'm going to hit save and run. Take a look at my clip. It is now copper material. If I select it and take a look at my quick access toolbar up here at the top, it's now saying copper. So doing that is the exact same as if I were to drive that material down here. Okay. I run the material rule that's down in that lower level component. I set it back to the blue. Right. And then if I come back to my assembly and run that guy, excuse me, now my clip is made out of copper. Okay. So let's take a look. I have a parameter in here, a user parameter called material list. It is a string-based parameter, a text parameter. There's currently nothing in it. So what I want to do is populate that material list parameter with all of the materials that are in the current library. Okay. That way I can allow the user to select and make sure he's spelling the material name right. He's not making a mistake in the spelling there, which is going to cause my rule to error out. I'm going to jump back into my material rule here. And I'm going to take a look again in my iProperties category. There is a list of materials snippet. If I hover over that, I see the tooltip. It applies the current list of materials to a parameter's multi-value list. Okay. A multi-value parameter, right, just has multiple values that I can select from. So I've added that to my rule here, multi-value list. The argument here being the parameter that I'm trying to drive, which is my material list parameter. Okay. I'm going to suppress that guy for the time being. So when I run this, really nothing's going to happen that we see on screen until we jump back into the parameters dialog box. Okay. If I go take a look in here now and hit that button, it's full of all the materials that are currently in my active library. Okay. Maybe I have a custom library that just my company uses for materials. that's a good way of getting all of that data in there for me. Okay. And then if I wanted to set that clip, right, I could copy and paste and say I'm going to push that iProperty material list to my material list parameter, and then I'm going to set the material of my clip to whatever value that happened to be selected. Actually, let's not do that yet. I got one other thing I'm going to do here first. Okay, so if I want to push that parameter out to multiple pieces, I could do the same thing that we were just looking at there doing. In this case, I've already set up a rule where I'm going to push that parameter out to multiple components. In this case, the clip, the sleeve, the ring, the eraser cap, those components that need to all be the same material based upon the selection that the user has made here. Okay. So I'm going to unsuppress this line. And all I'm doing here simply is creating a string array, right, called scomps, and I'm throwing it the value of clip, sleeve, ring, and eraser cap. And then for each comp that I'm calling it here in that scomps, it's going to go through and set the material of that to the value that I happen to pull out of there. Okay, so I'm going to save this. I'm going to make sure we'll go to aluminum first. Okay, that's what was balking at me earlier. Okay, so when I hit close here, and then I run this guy, right, all of those components became the same material. So I'm going to pop open my parameters dialog box here. And let's say I'm going to make it out of fabric now, right? And then those multiple components, the clip, the ring, etc., are all getting pushed, or that material property is getting pushed out to each one of those. So I don't have to have the separate individual line of this guy for each part that I wanted to do. And in this case, I've wrapped it in a try-catch so that if something went wrong, the rule wouldn't error out. Right? It would try to set the material property. If it didn't work, I would throw out a trace right line here and then move on, so I wouldn't get stuck. Okay? Or wouldn't balk at me or give me any errors. And just a simpler way of doing something to multiple components. Okay. So let's take a look at our snippets a little bit further. We've been using snippets in these last few webcasts, and we've actually been using what are called the system snippets. Okay, if I come up here to the top of my snippets portion of my dialog box, we've been on the system tab. Okay, these are the ones that come pre-installed. It's part of a specific XML file that's listed in the program files bin folder. You can go through there and modify that if you'd like. Highly suggest that if you're going to do that, make a copy of it first so you don't end up losing it. Here's the location that it is by default. Again, it's in Windows or C program files, Autodesk, whatever version you happen to be on in the bin English US. There's an iLogic snippets XML file. That is the system snippets. Okay. There's also ways of setting things as favorite and then filtering out this list to only show me, my favorites. So notice when I flip between favorites and no favorites, it turns off some of mine. Okay. And then right there next to it, I can edit which snippets I want to be favorites or not. So generally, it's not a great idea to go modify that system snippets file. If you want to turn certain things on and off, you can simply set them as favorites or not as favorites and filter that list out. Okay. There's also custom snippets. I flip over to my custom tab here. If I expand my snippets category here, again, these are the out-of-the-box custom snippets that come with Inventor, but you can create your own. Let's say that you always put a message box up at the end of a configuration. If you build a configurator and you want to allow your user to know when that's done, and you always tag it the same way. Rather than typing that out every time or having it stored somewhere that you copy and paste, you can save that as a custom snippet. So I'm going to build a message box here, and I'm going to use my message box wizard just to make it even easier. Okay, I'm going to give it a title of complete. The buttons, right, I can choose between multiple options there. The only thing I really want in this case is OK. I'm going to change my text to say configuration is complete. How many buttons, or what the default button is. In this case, I only have an OK button, so the default makes sense of just being one. And then what kind of icon, what's that symbol that you want to see? I'm going to throw up information, and then we can always preview this to see what that's going to look like. So there's my title. My information is that blue background with that white eye, right? And the only thing I have is OK. So when I hit OK to that, I get this long string, right? It's the message box that show, the text, the title, and then what all the other options are. In this case, it's the OK button, what's the icon look like, and then how many buttons, or I'm sorry, what is the default button. So in this case, I don't want to have to type that every time. I don't want to have to go through that wizard every time. So I'm going to save this as a custom snippet. So I select the text. That could be multiple lines. In this case, I'm only going to do a single line. And then I right-click, and down toward the bottom of my contextual menu is Capture Snippet. And that brings up my Edit Snippet dialog box. I would want to give it some type of title, config message box. And then what category do you want to put it in? Notice it says My Snippets. If I look over to the left here of my Custom tab, the only thing I have over there is the My Snippets. But I can type something new. If it's just you that's going to be using these, you may not put as much thought into that. But if you're going to end up using a shared custom snippet file, you might want to categorize maybe by environment or what the function is. In this case, I'm going to call it message boxes. So it's going to create a new category and put that thing inside of there. Down toward the bottom, I'll see the code. Right, there's the code that I had selected. And then I can apply a tooltip here if I want. There's only so many lines inside of a tooltip. So if I were to start typing text, it might end up giving me whatever text I type there's a tooltip, and then also whatever code it can still fit on there. So if I had a 15-line iLogic snippet that I'm capturing there, and I use that code as the tooltip, that's only going to show me, I think, the first 4 lines, maybe 3 lines. And then if I type anything additionally, it's just going to subtract from what it can show. Right? By default, if I don't do anything, then it's always going to use the code as the tooltip. But I can also hit the Use Code as Tooltip button for it to put that text in there. And then I can modify this if I wanted it to. Okay. So I'm going to hit OK. And again, over here to the left, I now see a new category called Message Boxes. And inside of that is that config message box. I always want to make sure I'm saving this, especially if you're working in an environment, again, where you have users that are all using the same shared snippets file. Since I'm working by myself, I really have no issue with overwriting that user snippets file. So I'm going to hit save. If you're working in an environment where, again, where other people are all using that same file, they won't see any changes until they close their IDE and then reopen it. Okay? The IDE meaning the rule editor here. Once they hit save and close or whatever they're doing there, and then bring it back up, is when they would see some new rules. It reads in that snippets file then. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and save this and close. I'm going to start a new rule just to show you that custom snippets tab right there. Oh, wrong button. So just like before, if I double click it, it puts that text inside of there for me. Okay. I can also open a custom snippets tab, or I can merge another snippets tab inside of what I currently have. Okay. So the active snippets file that you're working with will stay active until you load another one. So if you were pointing out to maybe some network share, and again, everybody's looking at the same snippets file, that's how you can share that data in between the two. And again, they wouldn't see any changes until you reopen that IDE file. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hit OK to that. So that's a little bit about controlling some materials. I'm going to jump into iLogic Forms. The forms are a customizable interface that allows your user or you to interact with the model through parameters, iProperties, rules, etc. I'm going to open up a finalized version of this pin. It's got a few bit more stuff inside of it that the other one didn't have. Forms are part of iLogic. There's nothing else required to install. If you've got iLogic, the add-in running, then you've got the forms in there running. Okay, there's two types of forms. There are internal forms, and then there are global forms. Internal forms are meant to work with the current document. It allows me to access parameters, properties, rules, etc. inside of that. Global forms are meant to work globally, not with just the document that I'm currently working on. Those global forms are an XML file that resides inside of your design data folder. Okay. Today we're only going to be looking at the internal forms, which is what my Forms tab is. So I'm going to go take a look at my parameters dialog box, and we have a few parameters in here, and some of them are marked as key. Okay. Anything that I tend to want to put on a UI or on the form, I will mark as key because we can filter it out when we get to that portion. Okay. So in order to create a new form, it's simply right-clicking in the Forms tab and choosing Add Form, or on my Manage tab in my iLogic panel, the expanded panel there's an Add Form as well. Okay. I'm going to add my form. There's four main sections to this. There's the Data tab over here to the left. That's where I can filter out, again, based on key or based on renamed parameters. So we see those listed out here. I can also see any internal and external rules, and then I see iProperties. Okay. Down below that is my toolbox. We'll talk about some of the more common features of the toolbox. Over to the right is where I actually build that form. That's where those parameter or the data from the Data tab and the tools will get drugged to and rearranged and sorted out. And then down here at the bottom is the properties that are going to show me the properties of whatever selected entity I have up in my tree area. Okay, so the form control is drag and drop. Okay? If I want to grab some parameters in order for my user to be able to control it, I simply left click and hold and drag over into my UI and let go. Okay. I see a FX. This is telling me that this is a parameter. This is my label column, and then I have my inventor name column. Okay. By default, those two will always match right off the bat when I'm dragging and dropping things in. So it's telling me there that the length shoulder parameter, in this case, the label, if I look over here to my preview, is telling me that it's length shoulder. Okay. I'm going to drag some of the other ones in there as well. Matter of fact, I'm going to drag all of these that I have marked as as my key, right? Those are ones that I said I want to put on my form. As I select each one of these, the link shoulder, the O-ring groove, down there toward the bottom, my parameters will change. Or I'm sorry, my properties will change, giving me control over what that control is looking like, okay? I don't like leaving those underbars inside of here, so I will go into my label quite often and change those. I'm just replacing those, and if we look over here to the right, I can see it looks a little bit better. Changing it up here in my label column is the same as changing it in the label property. It's going to accomplish the same thing there for me. Okay. So let's look a little bit about the toolbox. This is a very simple form. As I'm placing things, it builds them vertically. Maybe I want to include some things in horizontal rows. So that's when I would use the row from my toolbox. I'm going to, again, drag and drop and place 3 of them inside of my tree. Then I'm going to drag and drop the individual controls that I want inside of each one of those rows on top of the row. So I'm going to left click and hold the link shoulder. I'm going to come down, drag it right on top of the row that you want to put it in. And if I look over to the left, I see a little green arrow that's pointing right at it. That's telling me it's going to place that inside of that row. And I see a little bit of indentation there. I can do the same thing with the length extension. And now if I look over at my preview, I'll see length shoulder and length extension are now in a horizontal row. A way of cleaning up, per se, making my form look a little bit more like what I want it to look. Okay. So I can drag and drop these rows around as well. Maybe I want the O-ring groove and the hole required down below this guy. So this is where it gets a little tricky. If I move a little bit further down, you can see to the left I have a blue arrow that's kind of pointing down underneath. That's telling me it's going to put that row 2 underneath my row 1. So now I have those flip-flopped. And the same thing here again, if I go up, then I have a little up blue arrow over there to the left if I want that data to be up above it. Okay. I'm going to go and hit OK and then launch that form simply by hitting the form button there. And then I can modify what these values are, right, and see those features go on or off. Right. That's the handy part about building forms inside of iLogic is Inventor and iLogic are taking care of tying all that stuff together there for you. You don't have to worry about doing that kind of stuff on your own. So I'm going to go back and edit this form, right? I want to make a few more tweaks. I'm going to simply right-click on the Form 1 and choose Edit. Right. We're right back to where we were. In this case, I'm going to throw some tab groups on there. Tab groups are quite often used in order to get a lot more data on a form without taking up a whole lot more real estate. You don't necessarily want your form taking up the entire screen. So I've created 2 tab groups here. And if we take a look at my preview, we see those shown. Simply dragging and dropping into my tree area. And then I'm going to drag and drop the rows onto the specific groups. So I've got tab group 1 that's got data, and then tab group 2 currently doesn't have anything. So I'm going to put some iProperties in tab group 2. Flip over to my iProperties tab inside of my data group, and I'm going to drag just a couple on here. So now I've got my iProperties, and then I've got my parameters. Again, I can rename right here in the tree, or I could come down to my properties and rename these. Give them something that makes sense. parameters, and iProperties. Okay, let's take a little bit more about the properties of specific things. The length is the length shoulder and the length extension are both numeric parameters. So if I come down to my properties section, I have specific types of controls based upon what that is. So for a numeric, I can only have a text box or a slider. Right? If I want to allow the user to be able to type in anything, I would leave it as a text box. If I only want to control certain values, I want to go from 1 to 10 in increments of 1, or whatever those values happen to be, right? I've got a maximum and minimum, and then some kind of step value. And that's all dependent upon what type that control is. Again, in this case, it's a numeric parameter, so I have sliders and I have text boxes. If I take a look at my O-ring groove and my hole required, these are booleans, right? They're trues or falses. So the control types for these guys are a true, false, or a checkbox. I'm a bigger fan of the checkbox in a case like this. It's one less click for your user. I don't have to hit the drop down and then make a selection. I can simply pick that. If I hit OK and I jump back in there again, now I'm simply making that selection. Notice as I'm turning the O-ring groove on or off, I still have the ability to change the size of this thing. Right? Even if I've got the O-ring groove off, it still allows me to modify, if I could type, still allows me to modify what that value is. Now, once I come back and turn it on, it's still going to use the parameter that I pushed, but maybe I don't want the user to worry about controls that aren't currently going to be doing anything. Okay. So I'm going to go back in once again and edit that form. And controls have what's called an enabling parameter name. So in this case, the O-ring diameter and the O-ring location, I don't necessarily need if there's no O-ring groove required, right? So they both have an enabling parameter name, and it will only select or allow you to use a Boolean. And if that Boolean is true, then that control is going to be enabled. If that Boolean is false, and then that control will not be enabled. It just grays it out. It doesn't disappear. It doesn't hide visibility at all. You can't do any other type of control over it like you could maybe in Visual Studio. But again, the very basic portion of the building forms inside of iLogic. Okay? I might want to do it across an entire control. I could certainly control what that enabling parameter name is for both of those. Or I could do it against a group of entities. Unfortunately, there is no enabling parameter name for a row, but there is for a group. So I'm going to drag and drop a group onto that row 3 and then move these 2 inside of there. And then I do have an enabling parameter name, again, against that group 1. In this case, I'm going to choose the O-ring groove required. And then I'm going to turn off my borders. I don't necessarily want to see the borders. And if I want them in a row, I should have redone the order of that, but that's fine. Okay. Now if I hit OK and then go back, notice these guys are grayed out. As soon as I turn on the O-ring groove required, now I have that ability, again, to control what this is. A couple other things about forms. If you want to change what the label at the top and what shows, that is the label at the very top of my tree there. Right. That'll then show listed over here, as well as when I launch it. That's the title of my box. A little bit more about the labels. By default, it's all at left. I'm not a big fan of left. I prefer everything to be at the top. So you can control those, again, by control if you'd like. Notice if I come down here to O-ring groove location, I have a text location, left top, right bottom. Or I can control it per group, per row, or the entire form. Right? So if I come up to my very top level here, I can change my text to top. Now all my my labels for my controls are listed at the top. So one of the benefits about building those forms inside of iLogic, I don't have to worry about tying a bunch of things together. It's drag and drop, it's easy. I just don't have a lot of control over the look of it. I should say you don't have as much control as you do over if I was building it inside of some other program and exporting that DLL and building that, say, with Visual Studio.